Chapter 5. A Wretched Hive of Scum and Villainy. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. Obi-Wan Kenobi, a long time ago. Hello, Governor. Evan Nepean was tasked with finding an able and discreet officer to serve as the inaugural Governor of New South Wales. He advertised through the usual channels, but Britain's able and discreet officers all needed to stay home to powder their wigs. So Nepean offered the job to Arthur Phillip, a doggedly unexceptional performer most noted in Royal Navy circles for having two first names. Phillip was the man you would want in your corner if you'd run out of paper clips, or your workmates had left unwashed cutlery in the office sink. A man who could boldly requisition new stationery or prepare a dishwasher roster without fear or favour. Phillip's attention to detail, his fascination with rules and regulations, and his singular lack of humour can all be attributed to his being half German. Having a touch of the Teuton was not unusual in 18th century Britain, where the royal family had been kaisering it up since George Ludwig of Hanover, who couldn't speak a word of English, was crowned King George I in 1714. But Phillip came from both more humble and more linguistically advanced stock. Born within earshot of the Bow Bells, the governor-to-be was a Cockney. While many of his peers were embarking on a life of crime, Phillip swatted under the tutelage of his language teacher father, and could soon say, "Hello, Governor," in 5 languages, 6 if you count rhyming slang. Mrs. Phillip's previous liaison with a sailor was enough to get young Arthur into the Royal Hospital School at Greenwich, an institution for the relatives of dead or disabled seamen that took young boys and turned them into slightly older boys who could sail. At school, Phillip was the pale asthmatic kid with flat feet who was always picked last for team games. He caught colds easily, suffered from an assortment of mysterious abdominal pains, and was working on his squint. By the age of 15, he had set his spindly little legs on the road to lifelong hypochondria, and although he yearned for the discipline and well-pressed uniforms of the Royal Navy, was rejected as unfit for service. Instead, Phillip found himself holding a harpoon off the coast of Greenland. Whales are now killed only for research. Japanese scientists continue to study the effect on whales of being shot through the head, cut into thousands of pieces, put in a small plastic box, and smeared with wasabi. But in the 18th century, whales were killed for fun and profit. Night watchmen needed whale oil to light their lamps, women needed whale bone to hold up their corsets, and Frenchmen needed whale ambergris to make perfume. The governor-to-be spent many happy months spearing anything with a blowhole. 3 decades later, a whale would conspire in spearing him. Phillip finally managed to join the Navy in 1755, but was discharged on medical grounds the following year. He snuck back in a few months later, as Britain needed as many men as possible to kill the French, and it was hoped that the sickly Phillip might take out a few by sneezing on them. At the age of 24, Phillip married a 41-year-old widow for her money and took up farming and cloth manufacture. He soon separated from his wife, however, and returned to sea, taking command of a press gang. His job was to politely ask poor people if they wanted to join the Navy, and, if they declined, club them over the head and shackle them in the hold of a warship before they regained consciousness. In 1774, Phillip briefly joined the Portuguese Navy, as the Portuguese wanted officers who could kill the Spanish and English. While bobbing off the coast of Brazil, Phillip lost his right eye tooth after being hit in the face with heavy tackle. This remains common in the Royal Navy to this day. In keeping with its English roots, this conduct is known as teabagging. Phillip's dental misadventure would prove crucial in his later dealings with the Eureka of Sydney Cove. Phillip was forever seeking naval leave to visit French spas, in the hope that sitting in a tepid Gallic puddle would cure him of whichever random ailment he was currently fixated on. His ill health drew him to the attention of Nepean, who also served as Britain's spy master, and N inducted him into Britain's Secret Service. Phillip was the perfect spy. He spoke fluent French, his health gave him a great excuse for continental travel, and, if captured, he could confuse his interrogators by giving them 2 first names. Speaking fluent French is easy, as l'Académie Française vetting of additions to the French vocabulary means it has only a quarter of the words of English. This explains why the French are such good mimes. Napoleon saw in Philip a mind that was ordered, a tongue that could keep a secret, and a hand that could work a plough, weave cloth, and beat and shackle the less fortunate. Skills that would be invaluable in a fledgling convict colony. Are you still here? Sydney wanted the convicts out of his hulks by Christmas, but Philip was playing Grinch and deluged him with endless memos requesting additional shoes, scythes and sauerkraut, and that was just the S's. Philip also wanted more women. It was originally planned that about 70 female convicts and a few wives of Marines would sail south, with the remaining 1,400 old human cargo to be men. The heads of a plan recognised that this gender imbalance might cause gross irregularities and disorders, that is, a bit of gayness, which Philip proposed to address by delivering any colonist convicted of sodomy to the natives of New Zealand and let them eat him. Another suggestion was to round up all of Portsmouth's prostitutes and ship them to New South Wales, where they would be married to convicts by lot. But this option was rejected as the French had thought of it first, having settled New Orleans in a similar manner. Philip instead decided to economise by making use of the prostitutes he already had, writing of the female prisoners, "It may be best if the most abandoned are permitted to receive the visits of the convicts in the limits allotted them at certain hours." He also thought he might pick up some women at the Friendly Islands, Tonga, or the even friendlier islands, Tahiti. Just to be on the safe side, he collected an extra 100 female prisoners from country jails and permitted 25 wives and mothers of convicts to join the fleet. These women were Australia's first free settlers. Philip was introduced to his charges in January 1787 as they were loaded aboard the ships. He didn't know one end of a convict from the other, but soon worked out that the leg irons went on the bits that were closest to the deck. His officers were apprehensive about their new shipmates. Lieutenant Ralph Clark, the First Fleet's self-appointed misogynist and hypocrite, was aghast at how the women convicts lolled on the decks in indescribable filth, and they're all too scanty clothing. Lieutenant George Johnston, anxious about security, installed additional bars to separate the convicts from the sailors and marines, shortened their handcuffs and equipped their quarters with state-of-the-art murder holes so that they might be shot in relative safety. The First Fleet was one of the world's first examples of a public-private partnership. A business model designed to allow government to avoid responsibility, the private sector to maximise profits, and the consumer to wake up in a dark alley with no trousers and a feeling that he really should have said no to that last drink. The consumers of First Fleet Inc.'s no-frills transportation services found themselves being alternatively shafted by Admiral Middleton, the Comptroller of the Navy, and William Richards Jr., the private contractor responsible for fitting out the fleet. Middleton argued that convicts should only have 2/3 the rations of the Marines, as they would not expend much energy lying chained in the dark. Richards insisted that the weevils in the cheap flour he proposed to feed the convicts were a protein supplement and that the government should pay extra for them. The convicts found an unlikely champion in Philip, who threatened not to leave port until they were given better rations and luxuries such as clothes. Richards demanded an excise exemption for the rum he was taking to Botany Bay for the sailors on his privately contracted ships, giving birth to the Australian duty-free industry. Philip sought a similar arrangement for his Royal Navy sailors and Marines, but was denied, as Lord Sydney insisted that New South Wales was to be a dry colony. After the Marines threatened mutiny, Sydney agreed that they should be allowed to drink, but only for the first 3 years of settlement. The convicts were to be debarred in all cases the use of spirituous liquors. Philip finally set sail on 13 May 1787, only 6 months late. His obsessive attention to detail and inexhaustible memoranda meant that the First Fleet was remarkably well equipped. Sure, it lacked a full supply of women's clothing, but that didn't worry him unduly. The only people put out were the convict women, whom he planned to dress in trousers, and the convict drag queens, whom he planned to feed to the Maori. The founding felons. Philip had asked for healthy young men and breeding women for his colony, but was given Dorothy Handland, a sprightly 82-year-old perjurer, and Elizabeth Beckford, a septuagenarian cheese thief. Many First Fleet convicts had stolen food to ward off starvation. William Edmonds was transported for stealing a cow, while Thomas Eccles was exiled for filching bacon and 2 loaves of bread. If Elizabeth Beckford had joined forces with these criminal masterminds, the cheese and bacon burger would have been invented 140 years earlier. The First Fleet's youngest convict was John Hudson, a 13-year-old chimney sweep who had been imprisoned since the age of 9. Most of the First Fleeters were thieves. Edward Perkins stole a chicken, John Price a goose, and Henry Vincent a cask of currants. Nicholas English stole hair powder. John Nichols went one better and stole hair. William Francis was transported for 7 years for stealing a book entitled A Summary Account of the Flourishing State of the Island of Tobago. William Bryce received the same penalty for stealing a mirror. You don't actually have to break the mirror to get 7 years bad luck. Of the 759 convicts, 28 had committed no crime other than handkerchief theft. Another 78 had stolen goods that included handkerchiefs, and a further 225 stole other cloth goods, handkerchief precursors. The First Fleet was remarkably multicultural. There were French convicts, American convicts, Jewish convicts, and up to 16 convicts of black African descent, including Thomas Chaddock, a Jamaican who had rebelled against British imperialism by vandalising 12 cucumber plants. The male convicts came from a variety of professions, while most of the females were domestic servants or single women of no trade. Terrified that they would be regarded as seamstresses, these women would sometimes invent occupations to convince magistrates of their virtue. One, when asked what work she did, enigmatically replied, "I serve with asparagus." Historians have spent a disproportionate amount of time trying to calculate how many of the convicts were on the game. Although prostitution was not a transportable offence, prostitutes were frequently found guilty of other crimes. For example, stealing their drunken clients' handkerchiefs. Historioscankometric analysis suggests that about 20% of the female convicts had turned more tricks than David Copperfield, and a sizable portion of the rest were willing to try a little back-alley sleight of hand when the kids were hungry or when they wanted to buy a new dress. Philip, like the colonial administrators who followed him, held female convicts in particular contempt, complaining that many had diseases of long standing and had been discharged from the venereal disease hospitals as incurable. These unsatisfactory abandoned wretches, in the words of Philip, became the mothers of a nation. The spy who came out from the cold. The fleet's 11 ships soon left the dreary of England behind. The convicts who had been chained to the walls of their cramped holds before departure were now permitted to stroll about in the sunshine, whistling happy little convict tunes. Things were looking up. The only downer was the fleet's chaplain, the Reverend Richard Johnson, a gloomy preacher who would conceal himself in some dim corner and, upon hearing the approaching footfall of an unsuspecting convict, emerge wraith-like from the shadows brandishing self-help pamphlets. Johnson had a pamphlet for every occasion, including plain exhortations to prisoners, dissuasive from stealing, caution of profane swearers, exhortations to chastity, and religion made easy. See Adam. Adam is a man. See Eve. Eve is not. Adam likes Eve. Eve likes apples. Now Adam likes apples. Apples are bad. Now Adam and Eve are bad. Where are their clothes? The boundaries between felon and free on the fleet were already eroding. Lieutenant Johnson, who had so painstakingly installed additional security to prevent the admixture of seamstresses and seamen, now found that it got in the way of his nocturnal assignations with Esther Abrahams, a comely Jewish single mother who was into black silk lace. Esther was so into black silk lace that she stole 24 yards of it from a black silk lace shop, earning herself a one-way ticket to New South Wales. The Marines removed the hatches from the female prisoners' quarters, for reasons of health and comfort, and many of the women soon sported new handkerchiefs, the fleet's principal currency of negotiable affection. Lieutenant Clark was disgusted. He kissed a small portrait of his darling wife, Betsy Alicia, every Sunday and wrote her regular letters about the infamous hussies he was forced to guard. Among those Marines whose families were aboard, discontent was growing. The Navy Board had allocated their wives and children significantly less rations than Philip had arranged for convict families. They had joined the Marines to kill foreigners, not to watch some fat convict kid hoe into another ship's biscuit while their own little ones went hungry. The Marines would bide their time, and then they would make the convict-loving governor pay. Botany Bay Blues. Philip arrived at Botany Bay on 18 January 1788. He had lost only 2% of his convicts, which compared favourably to the 14% lost on the average voyage to America. The livestock had not fared so well. Many of the sheep had died of seasickness, and the fleet's kamikaze chickens had taken out the goats when their coop was blown into the goat pen during a storm. At first, Philip was not concerned by this loss of food. Joseph Banks had promised that Botany Bay was a land of milk and honey, where golden fields of wheat would spring up overnight, and fat young wallabies would willingly hop into the nearest frying pan and baste themselves in their own delicious juices. Philip had only bothered to pack 2 years' worth of lunch, assuming the colony would soon be self-sufficient. Philip rapidly realised that Banks was a lying bastard. The land at Botany Bay alternated between sand and swamp. There was almost no fresh water, the bay was too shallow to safely moor ships, and every part of the ground is in a manner covered with black and red ants of a most enormous size. The ground was also covered with Aboriginal people, whom Banks had assured Philip were few in number and so painfully shy that they would move out to avoid having to make small talk with their new neighbours. The Aborigines showed no such inclination, so Philip attempted to open an intercourse with them and conciliate their affections, as King George III had instructed during one of his more lucid moments. George, by the late 1780s, had started frothing at the mouth, talking to trees, shouting incoherently in German, and turning up to dinner with his underpants on his head. This was perfectly normal behaviour for a British monarch, but George's physicians became concerned when the royal we turned blue. George's condition has since been attributed to porphyria, a not very nice disease, or wearing too much makeup. Georgian cosmetics contained arsenic, which when absorbed can send you completely bonkers and do strange things to your wee. Philip's attempts at conciliation primarily involved dressing the natives with paper and other whimsical things, and not shooting them. There was also some cross-cultural wedding tackle display, as described by Lieutenant Philip Gidley King. They wanted to know what sex we were, which they explained by pointing where it was distinguishable. As they took us for women not having our beard grown, I ordered one of the people to undeceive them in this particular. Philip had expected to meet Aborigines, but he was unpleasantly surprised when just 6 days after his arrival he encountered more than 100 Frenchmen under the command of the haughty Jean-François de Galoup, Comte de la Pérouse. Rather than hang around displaying his genitals for the amusement of the natives and being patronised by the French, Philip packed his fleet and sailed up the coast to the nice harbour he had just discovered. New Sodom. On 26 January 1788, Philip named the large harbour north of Botany Bay after Lord Sydney, who was also big and wet. Here, at Sydney Cove, he would build a new society. It would be a society without money, as that would only give the convicts something else to steal. It would be a society without vice, where alcohol and tobacco would be shunned for the pleasure of the plough and the high of the hoe. It would be a society without shops or trade, where the state would provide equal rations for every man, whether felon or free. It would be a society without cities, where communal farms would house and feed a hardy agrarian people. Philip had invented the socialist state 6 decades before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels threw their first Communist Party. Unimpressed by Philip's utopian vision, 400 of the convicts soon scarpered off into the bush. La Pérouse woke up the next morning to a beach full of English criminals shouting "Vive la France!" while trying to thumb a lift home. La Pérouse offered a ride to Anne Smith and Peter Paris, a French waiter who had ended up serving 7 years rather than soup du jour. Anne and Peter never made it home, either drowning or ending up inside a cannibal after La Pérouse's expedition was wrecked off the Solomon Islands. Australia has always been unkind to European hitchhikers. Major Robert Ross of the Marine Corps, Philip's second in command, was not interested in rounding up the would-be new French citizens, or for that matter, in doing anything that required him to get off his generously upholstered Scottish backside. Ross spent every waking hour devising new ways to undermine the governor's authority. He insisted that the Marines' sole job was to protect the colony from any French, Russian or Spanish armies that might happen to be passing through the area. Ross hated the convicts because they received the same rations as he did, even though they did not have to defend Sydney from hypothetical invasion. Displaying both a meanness of spirit and a lack of understanding of the basic principles of refrigeration, Ross wrote in one of his many letters of complaint, "Could I have possibly imagined that I was to be served with no more butter than one of the convicts, I most certainly would not have left England without supplying myself with that article." Ross also hated the convicts for celebrating the unloading of the female prisoners with an orgy and not inviting the Marines. Surgeon Bowes wrote, "The men convicts got to them very soon after they had landed, and it is beyond my ability to give a just description of the scene and debauchery and riot that ensued during the night." Historians argue vehemently about what went down on the night of 6 February 1788. Traditional historians say that the convict women were victims of rape. Feminist historians say they were willing participants and should be celebrated as exemplars of empowered female sexuality. Aboriginal historians say that whoever was doing what to whom was doing it on the Aboriginal sacred site of Warrane, which wasn't very culturally sensitive. Revisionist historians say that the convicts all had a cup of warm Ovaltine and were in bed by 6. Postmodernist historians say that all of these views are equally valid. Lieutenant Clark had by now expanded so much ink in his misogynistic diary rants that he was forced to economise by referring to convict women as DBs rather than damned bitches. He wrote of the newly erected women's camp, "I would call it by the name of Sodom, for there is more sin committed in it than in any other part of the world." God destroyed the city of Sodom in a rain of fire. On the night of Sydney's inaugural clusterfuck, God's vengeance passed over the fornicators and instead fell upon the unfortunate Major Ross, smiting down 7 of his sheep and his pig with a lightning strike. Jobstown. Ross had it easy compared to most of the new colonists. Scurvy and dysentery cut through the camp like Freddy Krueger at a Year 10 formal. By March, Surgeon White's hastily built wooden hospital housed over 200 patients. Wild rains ripped through the settlers' rude wattle huts and downright abusive tents. Philip's house, like some pre-industrial IKEA nightmare, had been shipped to New South Wales in little boxes. The do-it-yourself government house was neither wind nor waterproof, and the permanently damp governor developed a pain in his kidneys that would stay with him for life. Sydney's rocky soil was unsuitable for ploughing, which was lucky because although the colonists had 12 ploughs, there were no beasts to pull them. The convicts were instead issued with hoes and instructed to till the fields by hand. Marsupial rats descended upon the first plantings of wheat and corn, and the few surviving crops yielded almost no grain. All but one of the fleet's 5 cows escaped. The one left behind, insane with loneliness, attempted to kill anyone who tried to milk it and was eventually shot in self-defence. Blowflies, bad weather, poor forage and dingoes wiped out 69 of Philip's 70 sheep. The colony's hogs were encouraged to roam outside the new town's bounds, where they were introduced to the niceties of Aboriginal firestick farming. The hungry settlers were tormented by the scent of crackling on the breeze and the delighted cries of Aborigines who had never tasted pig before. When the hogs were kept closer to home, they broke into the colonists' huts and ate their provisions. Philip issued an order that any hog caught trespassing was to be killed by the person whose property it damaged, making Sydney even more livestock unfriendly. Food theft escalated. Thomas Hill stole some bread and was punished with a diet of bread and water for a week. When this did not have the desired deterrent effect, Philip started hanging people. Thomas Barrett, who had stolen butter, peas and pork from the common store, was the first to hang. Just a month earlier, he had crafted the Charlotte Medal, the colony's first known work of art. This was the start of Australia's long-standing persecution of artists, a tradition that has forced Pro Hart to sell carpet cleaners and Ken Doan to eke out a meagre living flogging hideously coloured tea towels. Alcohol abuse was rife, despite the prohibition on convicts drinking. Getting hammered was integral to 18th century British life, and the New South Welshmen would do anything for a pint. Sailors and Marines traded hard liquor for soft comforts. Convicts broke into the wine stores, and there were numerous attempts at home brewing. Fights over alcohol were common, as were floggings for public intoxication. Life expectancy in the colony was low, as was productivity. The convicts, who were supervised by overseers from among their own ranks, soon realised that they had a monopoly on the means of production, i.e. themselves, and embarked on a series of successful industrial campaigns. The workers, untied, will never be defeated! Convict labourers refused to work standard hours, insisting on a system under which they would hoe 88 yards a day. By 1792, they had negotiated this down to 38 yards. Reverend Johnson, a later-day Job, found his faith sorely tested. No one would build him a church, but the colonists enthusiastically erected taverns and brothels. The colony was remarkably secular, despite Anglicanism being its official religion, and clergymen from other faiths being barred from entering the colony, except as convicts. Britain's lowest classes, who formed the bulk of the colony's population, often saw the church as a sheltered workshop for the privileged younger sons of the aristocracy. The disconnect between the church and the common man was exemplified by churchmen like Bishop Richard Watson of Llandaff, who refused to live in his diocese because his neighbours would be Welsh, and Dr Lancelot Blackburn, a one-time pirate-turned-prelate who installed a harem in his palace after being appointed Archbishop of York. With the colony still not a year old, Reverend Johnson wrote that the government should send out another fleet to take us all back to England, or to some other place more likely to answer than this poor wretched country, where scarcely anything is to be seen but rocks, or eaten but rats. The conciliation of affection. When the Eora elders looked down from the nearby hills, they saw a settlement of lazy, drunk, violent criminals with poor accommodation, health, nutrition and life expectancy outcomes. Surely these degraded people would quietly fade away or assimilate into Eora society. If not, the Eora would have to consider an intervention. There was one among the pale spirits, however, who was familiar. The one with the runny nose, gimpy walk, and most importantly, missing tooth. The Eora marked a boy's transition to manhood by removing an eye tooth, which made Philip, an initiated Eora warrior, returned from the dead. Here was a man/zombie they could deal with. The governor was also keen to deal with the Aborigines. The colony had a slight legitimacy problem, and Philip was desperate to find the savage with the authority to hand over the title deeds to New South Wales in exchange for a couple of mirrors and a blanket. There were a lot more guys with spears hanging around than Banks had advised, and if they ever got their shit together, they could make the colonists' lives both uncomfortable and short. Philip's desire to give the natives everything that can tend to civilise them, the aforementioned mirrors and blanket, and a high opinion of their new guests, was undermined in a number of ways. La Perouse had built Australia's first mainland fort before leaving Botany Bay, writing, "The precaution was necessary against the Indians of New Orleans, who, though very weak and few in number, like all savages, are extremely mischievous, for they even threw darts at us immediately after receiving our presents and caresses." La Perouse saw the darts of the Eora and raised them a musket, sending a number of them to an early meeting with their ancestors. The Eora did not distinguish the invaders at Botany Bay from those at Sydney Cove and were wary of Philip's gifts, which in their experience were a prelude to getting felt up and shot. The convicts, whose opportunities for theft were limited in the new colony, had taken to raiding Eora huts. They traded Aboriginal tools and weapons for rum, rations and clothing with visiting sailors who took the artefacts back to Britain as souvenirs. In contrast, an Aboriginal man who stole 2 shovels and a pickaxe was shot. Philip wanted to resolve these cultural misunderstandings with the Eora ambassador. The fact that the Eora were made up of diverse tribal groups, frequently in conflict with each other, did not deter him. If the Eora were too disorganised to nominate an ambassador, then Philip would nominate one for them. The nomination process involved being shown a mirror, clubbed over the head by Lieutenant Johnson and tied up in the bottom of a rowboat. The unwilling emissary who refused to give his name was dubbed Manly. Philip invited Ambassador Manly to lunch and then, having got the diplomatic niceties out of the way, had him cuffed and tethered in the embassy. That is Philip's backyard. Bilateral relations were definitely improving when Manly revealed that his name was Arabanu, but his dropping dead covered in hideous pustulent sores was a setback. Arabanu may have had diplomatic immunity, but he had no immunity to smallpox. A sneeze was far more deadly to the first Australians than all of the muskets the British Empire could bring to bear, with about half of the Eora wiped out by the pox in 1789. Philip blamed the French, who despite their philosophy and ornate gardens, were notorious carriers of disease. Smallpox was distinguished from the Great Pox, which the English knew as syphilis, or the French pox. The English would name anything they found unpleasant or rude after the French, e.g. French letters, condoms, French leave, leaving a party without informing the host, French postcards, pornography, a French bath, a full body wash, French kissing, kissing with tongues, and French toast, really disgusting toast. The French retaliated by calling syphilis le maladie anglaise, the English disease, condoms la capote anglaise, the English raincoat, and being rude to party hosts, filet à l'anglaise, the English run, but stopped there because they liked kissing, bathing, pornography and toast. Today it is fashionable to blame the Eoran smallpox outbreak on the Macassans, who are even more foreign than the French. However, the fact that smallpox turned up in Sydney the year after British settlement and that there is no evidence of earlier infection in communities to the north suggests the British were to blame. Thanks to the smallpox epidemic, there were many Aboriginal children for concerned Christians to adopt, so that they might be raised knowing Jesus and how to scrub white people's floors. Some of the early colonists were not overly concerned whether a prospective adoptee's family was dead. Lieutenant Clark wrote of an Aboriginal couple, "I asked if they would give me the children for my hut, which they seemed to wish most for, but they would not on any account part with their children." Philip had now shot, abducted and infected the Eora, who were beginning to seriously regret not placing themselves on the Do Not Call register after being contacted by Cook. This conciliation of affection malarkey was proving deucedly difficult. New order. In Sydney, a new society was taking shape. The convicts forged relationships with each other and with those who shared their exile. Lieutenant Johnson had settled down with Esther Abrams and would stay with her until his death in 1823. Lieutenant Philip Gidley King, who had established a small colony on Norfolk Island in the first weeks of settlement, took up with his housekeeper. David Collins, the colony's Anglo-Irish Deputy Judge Advocate, eventually shacked up with Anne Yates, a young milliner from the wrong side of the bench. While Collins' wife was writing romance novels back in England, Anne gave him 2 sons. And a really nice hat. Things were looking up for convicts like James Roos, who had now served their time and were free, or would have been if Philip had stopped obsessing about sodomy and sauerkraut for long enough to pack a record of their sentences. Philip hoped that the convicts whose sentences had expired would forgive him this minor administrative oversight and keep on convicting, because they were jolly good at it. The Marines had now split into 2 factions. Captain Watkin Tench and Lieutenant William Dawes led a group that wished to work for the benefit of the colony and build relationships with the Eora. Dawes took in an Aboriginal girl, Patya Garang, and produced a dictionary of the Eora language, an eclectic work that omitted many common words but contained phrases including gitty gitty, to tickle under the armpit, matagara bungam nagabaga, we shall sleep separate, and nyamang candle, Mr. D, put out the candle, Mr. D, suggesting that Dawes' relationship building had been successful. The opposite faction was led by Philip's unhappy deputy, Major Ross. Ross continued to feel hard done by, despite having secured a second salary by appointing his 9-year-old son second lieutenant of Marines. He was indignant that his Marines were subject to laws set down by Philip, rather than to military discipline. When 7 of his men were hanged for pilfering from the food stores, he snapped. Ross encouraged the Marines to boycott jury duty, which would have destroyed the colony's fledgling legal system, as Philip believed criminals should be judged by a jury of their peers, as long as their peers were not criminals. Ross was pulled reluctantly into line, but then Philip established a convict police force that took particular pleasure in arresting Ross's soldiers. George Barrington was one of the colony's early police officers. Barrington had picked the pockets of London's rich and famous, once lifting a £30,000 snuff box from Count Orloff of Russia. He was so persuasive and likeable that juries acquitted him of most of his crimes, while the London press made him a celebrity, dubbing him the Prince of Rogues. After being sentenced to transportation, he attempted to escape from prison dressed in his wife's clothes. He was appointed a constable within months of arriving, and within 4 years was chief constable at Parramatta. After convicts started arresting Ross's men, Ross made it clear that he thought Philip had lost his mind. Philip banished Ross to Norfolk Island, where it was hoped he could do no further harm. Here, Ross introduced a bizarre legal system of his own devising. Whenever a sow died, a formal coronial inquiry was held, and unless a natural cause of death could be established, all the convicts were punished. Ross allocated land to teams of convicts and offered prizes to those who gave him the most corn. The convicts quickly discovered a loophole in the scheme and spent most of their time raiding each other's gardens. Lieutenant Clark travelled with Ross to Norfolk Island and fathered a daughter on one of the depraved harlots he so despised. At least he had the decency to name the girl Betsy after his wife. Ross's trip to Norfolk Island had dire consequences for both Ross and the colony, because Captain John Hunter, who was dropping off Ross on his way to China to pick up enough takeaway to feed Sydney, ran Philip's largest ship, the Sirius, onto Norfolk Island's reef. The convicts sent to salvage the wreck raided its rum and set it alight. Ross lost all of his personal effects, and the colony lost its supply ship. Hunter had a proud history of sinking, having been wrecked off Norway at the age of 8 and involved in a further shipwreck before totalling the Sirius. For some reason, Philip still gave him the keys to the boat. With the Sirius lost, Sydney was fast running out of food. Philip insisted that officers dining at Government House bring their own bread rolls, and David Collins conducted a judicial inquiry into a convict's loss of a cabbage. Philip ordered that the colony's dwindling supply of seed grain be soaked in tubs of urine to deter theft, but still, some of the convicts could not refrain from stealing and eating it. Clothing was also in short supply. Convicts laboured naked to preserve their tattered garments, and Philip ordered a shoe embargo, with footwear issued only to those who particularly distinguished themselves. Believing that they had been left to starve to death in the nude by an uncaring Briton, the colonists erected a signal post and lookout at the entry to the harbour, thus fondly indulging the delusion that the very circumstances of looking for a sail would bring one into view. Even this modest enterprise was thwarted by the Eora, who all sported new red headbands within minutes of a signal flag being raised. Contiki Turulai Urulai Adati. In 1789, King George III celebrated no longer being mad by pardoning all of the women on death row and ordering their transportation to New South Wales, which was hoped would inoculate the colony from the much-feared epidemic of gayness. The Lady Juliana set sail mid-year, with John Nichol, the ship's steward, reporting that most of the women on board were streetwalkers, and that when we were fairly out to sea, every man on board took a wife from among the convicts, they nothing loath. The floating brothel, as the Lady Juliana came to be known, arrived in Sydney in June 1790, after one of the slowest convict voyages. She had stopped at numerous ports along the way, so that her passengers could resume their former trade and her officers could claim a slice of the action. The Sydney colonists, who had spent 3 years bemoaning the lack of female companionship, were distraught at the arrival of, as Judge Advocate Collins put it, a cargo so unnecessary and so unprofitable as 222 females, instead of a cargo of provisions. A store ship turned up 2 weeks later, but the colonists' joy was soon shattered by the arrival of the remaining 3 ships of the Second Fleet. William Grenville, who had taken over from Lord Sydney after the Lady Juliana's departure, was determined to slash transportation costs. The slave traders Camden, Calvert and King offered him a hefty discount on the proviso that he pay them per convict loaded onto the ships in Britain rather than per convict unloaded in Sydney. This sounded like a good deal to Grenville. It was not a good deal for the convicts. Camden, Calvert and King had a financial incentive to keep their slaves alive, as American plantation owners had worked out that dead Africans were deficient in the cotton-picking department. However, Grenville's upfront payment meant that a convict's profitability was inversely proportionate to his or her life expectancy. Who were the convicts to stand in the way of market efficiency? The slavers realised they could economise on guards by keeping the convicts chained in the hold. They then saved on chains by bolting the prisoners together. Now that they could only move an inch, the convicts did not need all that expensive legroom. Neither did they need warm clothes, as they would not be wandering about in the cold, fresh air. Their woolens and other possessions were thrown overboard, and the extra space used to store food. Food? Hang on. Who said the convicts needed food? The starving convicts ate the poultices applied to their weeping sores. A prisoner bolted to a corpse would conceal his neighbour's death in the hope of claiming his meagre rations, a ruse that proved successful until the cloying scent of putrefaction gave him away. The slavers celebrated their arrival in Sydney by staging the world's first production of Dante's Inferno on water, having successfully transformed more than a quarter of their convicts into ex-convicts. Emaciated corpses were thrown overboard. Filth-smeared human scarecrows swarming with lice crawled onto deck before expiring. Others died as they were loaded into rowboats or writhed in agony from scurvy. The ship's captains set up shop, selling the dying convicts unwanted rations to the colonists. Sydney was kept awake by the triumphant howls of dingoes exhuming hastily dug mass graves. When news of the Second Fleet reached Britain, the government agreed it was unspeakable, and so discouraged anyone from speaking about it. Captain Donald Trail of the Neptune, the most infamous of the fleet's death ships, was put on trial for cruelty and murder, but was acquitted after Lord Nelson said he was a jolly fine fellow. The government had every reason to cover up the horrors of the Second Fleet. It had just commissioned Calvert, Camden and King to transport another 1,880 convicts to New South Wales. Yes, Mr. Ambassador. Phillip hadn't given up on finding a new Aboriginal ambassador, but potential applicants were put off by the work conditions, which primarily involved being tied up in Phillip's backyard and dying an agonising death. Phillip was forced to resort to the tried and true mechanism of banging some poor unsuspecting native on the head, trussing him up in the bottom of a boat and rowing like buggery while his friends were still looking for their spears. Phillip, determined not to run out of ambassadors this time, ordered his men to capture a spare. This proved to be a shrewd move, as one of the ambassadors, Colby, soon left his diplomatic post. The post had been hammered into the soil of Phillip's backyard. Colby managed to escape after gnawing through the rope that tethered him to it. The other ambassador decided to stick around. Woolawari Boinda Bubdabunda Wogtrori Benelong, or Benelong to his mates, was a man of great charm, intellect and humour. He was also a first-class pantsman, or during those times he set aside the trousers Phillip had given him, a first-class kangaroo-skin thong around the waist man. Prone to changing moods, swinging rapidly from laughter to rage, Benelong loved nothing more than a good fight. Watkin Tench wrote of his new friend, "Love and war seemed his favourite pursuits, in both of which he had suffered severely." When Benelong was not abducting Camaragal women and being speared by their relatives, he was trying to understand what made the invaders tick, and, most importantly, what he could get out of them. Benelong soon realised that the governor would do almost anything to conciliate his affection, and while Phillip's officers chewed miserably on their own bread rolls at official dinners, he sat beside them loudly demanding another pig. As the colonists fought and fornicated for rags, Benelong strolled through Sydney wearing his yellow nankeen jacket or his red coat with silver epaulettes. This seriously upset the convicts, who found it difficult to look down on the black man when the black man was munching on the colony's only bacon sandwich and looked like he'd just stepped off the cover of Esquire. Governor Phillip was deeply hurt when Bennelong escaped, but Bennelong would not be a stranger. He was forever popping out of the nearest bush and making polite inquiries of startled colonists as to the health of the governor and his housekeeper, one of the many objects of Bennelong's amorous affections. Philip's heart lifted when Bennelong sent him a gift of whale blubber. The clans had gathered to celebrate the beaching of a sperm whale on Manly Beach, and Philip was invited over for sashimi. This was exactly the kind of diplomatic breakthrough Philip had been waiting for. During the festivities, Philip's eye was drawn to a spear lying on the ground. When Bennelong picked it up and passed it to the wise man Wilmering, Philip genially approached to take a closer look. The governor was soon able to inspect the spear's shaft in considerable detail, but was unable to see the interesting barbed tip that was now protruding from his back. Bennelong scarpered as the critically injured Philip was dragged to a boat under a hail of spears and stones. Philip took his spearing with surprising equanimity, understanding that it was payback for the ills his arrival had brought upon the Eora. He sent men out looking for Bennelong in the hope that they may be reconciled. Bennelong eventually returned to Sydney after Philip agreed to build him a house on the point of Sydney Cove that now bears his name. Philip stopped feeling the love, however, when the Aboriginal warrior Pemulwuy speared his gamekeeper John McIntyre. McIntyre was hated by the Eora for being trigger-happy on the cultural relations front, but was popular in Sydney. In a colony close to starvation, an Irishman with a dead possum or two up his sleeve was everyone's friend. McIntyre was a particular favourite of Surgeon White, who was a keen naturalist. McIntyre would venture into the bush and happily blast away at any bird, lizard or snake foolish enough to stick its head up, with his dead offerings contributing to the publishing success of White's catchily titled Journal of a Voyage to New South Wales with 65 plates of nondescript animals, birds, lizards, serpents, curious cones of trees and other natural productions. After Pemulwuy killed McIntyre, Philip ordered Tension Dawes to fetch him the heads of 2 random Eora in a couple of bags he had on hand for just such an occasion. A further 10 Aborigines were to be captured and lynched in front of their mob. Tension Dawes spent several days studiously failing to find any Aborigines, although Tent shot and wounded one from a distance to convince Philip he wasn't a complete shirker. Philip eventually calmed down and withdrew his orders for indiscriminate massacre, but he had irretrievably damaged his conciliation credentials. Bennelong remained in his house on the point, but no longer kept a little portrait of the governor on his bedside table. Pemulwuy remained at large, his name whispered around the campfires of his people. Last drinks. Philip, laid low by illness, sailed for England on 11 December 1792. He took Bennelong and a spare, Yerramawani, with him and retired to the spa town of Bath, where he married a 43-year-old spinster he'd met in a library. Mrs. Philip made her husband's remaining years an absolute misery. Mrs. Philip accused her long-suffering husband of having wild affairs and conspiring against her, neither of which were in Philip's playbook. Do not try to pick up chicks at the library. It always ends badly. James Roos finally convinced Philip that his sentence had expired and became the colony's first self-sufficient farmer and land grant recipient, proving that a Cornish burglar could make something of himself in this new society. Reverend Johnson continued to be spectacularly unsuccessful at spreading the word. When he paid out of his own pocket for a church to be built, one of the colony's more enthusiastic atheists burnt it to the ground. Johnson became the colony's most successful cucumber grower and an enthusiastic advocate of Thomas Chaddock's repatriation to Jamaica. Ralph Clark returned home to his darling Betsy Alicia, who accepted that what happens on Norfolk Island stays on Norfolk Island. Tears were shed when he died of yellow fever in June 1794. Major Ross, to the relief of all concerned, died the same month. William Dawes was forced to leave the colony after publicly criticising Philip over the Pemulwuy affair. He was appointed governor of Sierra Leone in 1792 and later became a missionary, establishing schools for the children of West Indian slaves. Watkin Tench became famous for his sensitive girly diary about his days in New South Wales and is the Australian historical figure that mothers would most like their daughters to bring home. Although their enthusiasm dims somewhat when it is pointed out that their daughters will need a return airfare to Devon, a flashlight and a shovel. Esther Abrahams still looked hot in black lace, and her lover now served in the New South Wales Corps, the unit that had replaced Ross's ineffectual Marines. Nobody would accuse George Johnson and his new cronies of being ineffectual. Their ambition to remake New South Wales in their own image was fuelled by a powerful elixir, a draught that men would kill and die for, a base liquid that they would transmute into gold. Its name was Realm!